My name is Valerie, and I'm an alcoholic. Valerie. And I currently serve as your District 5 Archives Chair and Archivist. And I lost my train of thought. Thanks, Riley. That's all right. My home group is Eastside Earlyrisers, and thank you for making me laugh. This is a hard thing for me to do. And I really appreciate that. My home group is Eastside Earlyrisers, and I'm going to talk to you today about what it took for the big book to come to be. And you may wonder, my sobriety date is November 28th, 2015. And if that sounds young, it is. And so, the question is, why am I the one who's doing this talk? And, I am not an expert, but I'm a student, and I can tell you that early on, I was fortunate that early on, someone invited me to come to an area assembly. Now, when I first came in, I was a wreck. I couldn't look you in the eye, and I didn't have a sponsor when that happened, when I went to the assembly. And if someone had approached me another way, I probably wouldn't be standing here today, because my background, my childhood, there was a lot of abuse and neglect in it. And so I didn't trust anybody. And what I had to do was go to an assembly and experience the love in the room. And I met 7 delegates while I was there who welcomed me. One did something incredible that I will never forget. But in any case, I knew that I wanted what they had. I already knew that I wanted what AA had, but when I went to that assembly, I knew that service was for me. And I'm a certifiable service geek and a history geek. And following that, now I was only a month sober, but when I came back from that trip, my home group, their GSR, had left. And so they had an interim job open, and they decided I was it at 1 month sober. So I had to go to district, and I had to start, being of service. And I had the opportunity to do some reading to prepare for a talk I had to give there on the first concept. And that was part of my spiritual awakening. I know it sounds strange, but that came first for me. I read all the articles that Bill W. wrote from Language of the Heart that related to the creation of those concepts, and I had a spiritual awakening. I knew that I was in the middle of something that I could trust, and that's where my journey began. So I started reading the history books, and that's where I started. And somewhere in there, my recovery got taken care of. I had a 4th step that lasted 14 months about the same time, but I finally got everything caught up. So I want to say a couple of things to clarify. History is anecdotal, and as has been shared already, that means that 2 people can have the same experience or be in the same place but have a different experience that they describe differently. That's a storytelling. That's what anecdotal history is. And a large part of our AA history is anecdotal. We have a lot of newspaper clippings and, minutes and things like that we can confirm actual dates. But if you hear something that seems strange to you, that doesn't quite jive with something that you've heard before, it's because there are slight differences in the dates when things happened, and because of that. So what I want to share about the importance of the writing of the Big Book and the process that our fellowship went through to create that is basically in parallel to our recovery process. God puts me through things that I don't want to go through to make me grow. And that's what our fellowship did in terms of creating this Big Book. So the end result is that our Big Book and our fellowship and this story is the same. We learned an awful lot about how to get along together and the things that we needed to do to survive. And so our traditions and our concepts follow along this story from start to finish. So I want you to listen for them when I'm speaking. So I'm going to set the stage here. We're not. Do I need to start slideshow? Sorry.
You go start the slideshow.
Technical difficulties. Operator error.
No, it's all right. And then you just push that button as you want to move
This
along.
one, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a presentation about the writing and the publication of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. So I'm going to have to set the stage a little bit. If you were at my last talk, where it left off is when Bill and Bob got together and Group 1 was formed. Bill stayed in Akron for 3 months at that time before going back to New York. The whole period is set right in the middle of the Great Depression, which is the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrial world. And it started with the crash in October 1929. Millions of investors were wiped out in that crash. And that has a lot to do with how we got together. So there were many failures and successes in terms of, getting people sober. And how they did it back then was they were part of the Oxford group. And I forgot to change. I wanted to show you that we've got 3 legacies, and that's what we're going for through this. So the Oxford group is kind of how they did their program. They were part of the Oxford group at that point. And Oxford group was pretty strict. You'll recognize on the right side, things that are familiar, that result came out to be our steps. But these absolutes were pretty tough for the alcoholics to take. But they had practices that are similar to us. They had meetings, they had devotions and prayer and meditation. They had checking with a partner, which is different than what we do here. Alcoholics didn't like that group checking stuff. Basically what happened there is the group would get together, they would read a meditation, and out of something like this, the upper room, this was actually in publication at the time. And they used this, and they would read a meditation, they'd read a daily devotion, then they would sit in quiet, complete silence for at least a half hour with a pad of paper and a pencil waiting for guidance. And then they would check that guidance with each other. So I could get guidance for you, Louise. And somebody could check me. I mean, I could tell you what you were supposed to do because God was telling me what you were supposed to do. And other people would say yeah or no. And, that was how they did it. Okay? Alcoholics didn't like that at all. They didn't like sitting still. So they were fidgety and jonesy and all of that. So basically, they divided themselves into what we will call in Akron the alcoholic squad of the Oxford group, and in New York the drunk squad of the Oxford group. Okay, so these books on the table to the right over here are the kinds of materials that they had at that time when the big book wasn't there. This is kind of the formative stuff that resulted in our fellowship. Oxford Group was a Christian organization, non-denominational, and basically they would read the 3 parts of the Bible that they would study from would be the Sermon on the Mount, 1 Corinthians, and the book of James. But this Common Sense of Drinking book was kind of the only book that they had that said anything about alcoholism. Emmett Fox was a pretty popular one, and these are all books that are documented to have been in Dr. Bob's library. Okay, I've brought them here for you today. So I want to show you. Okay, so this is where they met in New York. This is the Reverend Sam Shoemaker, who was a great friend of ours. The Calvary Episcopal Church in Manhattan was the U.S. headquarters for the Oxford Group. Now, Oxford groups were a small group-based organization, supposed to be intimate. So the Oxford Group in New York met around the corner in the Mission for the drunks, and the real sinners. Yeah. So in Ohio, in Akron, they met in the home of T. Henry and Clarice Williams. They had a house that they nearly lost, and they turned it over to God. Now, these are Oxford groupers that I'm talking about. These are really good people who were friends of ours for a really long time. And part of what I want to tell you about today is we're not here without these non-alcoholic people. So they gave their house to be used for the Oxford group meetings to happen. Now, families came to Oxford group, so the drunks, the alcoholic squad would come there and their families would kind of go off, and basically the drunks would go upstairs. And that's kind of what happened in Akron. So this is Towns Hospital, and this is our good friend Charlie Towns. This is where they did sobering up in New York. This is where Bill went 3 times. Now, this is a high-end rehab. In today's dollars, it would have cost more than $1,000 a day. And his brother-in-law paid 3 times for him to go there. In Akron City Hospital is where Bob did his thing. There it was a lot less money. All they paid for was a private room. And nothing else, nothing medical was done. Absolutely nothing. So I'm going to talk to you I want to also show you the next slide, if I can make that work. There. Okay, so this is Clinton Street. This is where Bill and Lois lived. They lived on the top floor. It's 4 stories. It was her family home. But they had meetings. They were having meetings. The drunk squad were kind of getting away from the Oxford group, and Bill got a little guidance that the other Oxford groupers didn't like so much. They started meeting Tuesday nights in his home. In Akron, Dr. Bob's house was where both Clinton Street and this is Ardmore Avenue, the Smith's house. And I tried to get pictures of Lois and Ann that were period about the time that we're talking about. They both served as halfway houses of sorts. So it was part of their process. So I'm going to try to explain to you how they did things in Akron, where there were more successes than in New York. But this is kind of how our program formed. And it has a lot to do with the writing of the big book. You couldn't just walk into an Oxford group meeting. You had to be sponsored. You had to be behaving. You had to be surrendered. So basically what would happen is that they would require hospitalization. Dr. Bob required hospitalization. They'd go to Akron City Hospital, and they would just kind of detox with no medical help. But when they were defogged, as they called it, the group would start to visit. And what they would do before that, this is a prospect. So a wife would call and say, my husband is like out of control. What do I do? And they would take him to the hospital, and then they would interview everybody that guy knew to get the goods on him so that they could figure out what the right setup was, who was the right person, in what order their stories would be most effective. And so they would do that for 5 or 6 days, every person coming visiting privately. It was very personalized. And at a certain point in time, Dr. Bob would come and give them the medical facts that this is a fatal disease. And then he'd give them the hard news about that you can survive if you don't take a drink, or you need a spiritual solution. And what they would do is, if you were at that point, down on your knees by the hospital bed, and you would have to say a prayer, and then you would be allowed to go to the Oxford group. And your first meeting there, you'd be taken up those stairs, and they wanted to make sure you were really surrendered. So they gave you the goods, basically. But what happened after that was that the entire community kind of wrapped their arms around you. They were really not doing well financially, any of them, and they didn't have telephones. So they had to get face-to-face contact on a regular basis. They had dinners every night of the week. People's homes were open to one another, and they actually made handmade address books. The wives made handmade address books with full names and addresses so people would know how to find them. So neither the Wilsons or the Smiths had any financial security. Dr. Bob was they were about to lose this house. He wasn't able, Bill had none either, because he couldn't find work. And he had just been told, as we start the story, he had just been told by his group in New York that, no, you can't accept that professional job with Towns. And why? And Dr. Bob could never build his practice back quite right after he got sober and made amends. That amends process was very, very difficult for him. And it was the one thing he wouldn't do. Dr. Bob had been going to Oxford group meetings for 2.5 years when Bill and he met, and he wasn't doing the deal. Bill had been going to Oxford group meetings about 6 months when they met. So where we're going to get it up here, take the story forward here, is November 1937. Oh, and this is in Dr. Bob's house in the archives. I'm sorry, I meant to forward this. This is a stained glass window that's in their archives, the rendition of the man by the bed. And that's how they 12-stepped in Akron. So November 1937, Bill comes to visit Bob, and he's pretty upset. He's got to let Bob know that New York has decided that they're kind of slipping away. They're not going to be participating as much in the Oxford group. Bill and Lois did, but none of the other alcoholics did from that point forward. For the reasons that I have said earlier, but mainly this whole idea of the hard feelings of that guidance that alcoholics had to have a special meeting. The OGs didn't like that at all. So that was one of the problems. He wanted to come and tell Dr. Bob in person that we've made this decision. But the other one is that Abby had started drinking again. And so Bill was really, he had some sad stuff that he needed to come and talk to Dr. Bob about. So they're talking, and they take the opportunity to review their work over the last 2 years. And there have been a lot of people that didn't make it. But they started counting noses, and they came up with a number that they didn't realize were their successes, and it was 40. 40 people had some lasting sobriety. So they came up with, and so they realized a chain reaction had started from their meeting, and that it had the potential to wrap around the world eventually. So what are we supposed to do? We're a secret society of sorts. Alcoholics are not well thought of in the community, and anonymity is really, really important for the reason that I stated with Dr. Bob's reputation. He lost his practice as a result of that. Now, he was a surgeon, to be fair. He was a proctologist, so nobody wanted the scalpel in his hand, if he'd been drinking, and they weren't sure that he wasn't drinking anymore. Now, that got better later, but I want to state for the record here that Dr. Bob never received one dime for the 12-step work that he did in his life, ever. So they came up with these 3 proposals. How are we going to get this done? And so they decide, okay, they'd have to have paid missionaries, number 1, and they'd have to have a chain of hospitals, number 2, and they'd have to have literature. And I'm sorry for the typo here. They needed to put their program down on paper is what that's supposed to say. So, Bill and Bob, they talked it around, Bob had the reservations that you would expect him to have, but Bill was pretty gung-ho, and Bob kind of went along with him usually. So what they did is they went right over to T. Henry and Clarice Williams, and they had a special meeting. What they really needed was a book, though, is what this slide is saying, and the 3 sources where this came from. They needed the message to not be garbled or distorted, and that's what had been happening. It was a word-of-mouth program, and as you know, when you play telephone, if I tell you something and you tell the next person, then it comes out different than it went in at the end of it. And they were seeing that already in Akron and New York. So they wanted to have some consistency. So here's the living room of the Williams house. This is where they had their Oxford group meetings. There were 18 people called to this meeting. Bill and Bob went right over, and they talked over these proposals, which, the same complaints, the same concerns, that we're going to have, property's going to ruin us, that money's going to ruin us, that professionalism's going to ruin us. Those all came up. Bob brought them up. They were brought up here. Bill was the minority opinion, though, and he was driving this thing. So eventually they said, yeah, you can do it. So he goes back to New York, and let the fund drives begin. There were still people very wealthy in New York City, lots of them. And so they went back, and they tried to stir up some business. And they tried to get donations because they thought their cause was really, really important. But nobody was interested in donating to the cause of drunks because it was a question of morality versus illness. That's what they thought at the time. Charity should be better directed at curing diseases or, the Red Cross after natural disasters, even though we all know that we're natural disasters and we need curing. So by this time, Hank and Jimmy and Fitz were part of the New York group, and two of them were really super salesmen, and so they just got this idea. They went around. They got armed with a list of wealthy people and tried to go get it, but nothing happened. And Bill, after several months with no donut results, Bill starts to get a resentment against those rich people who aren't giving up their money. And he was a worrier too. And you will hear it said that he had imaginary ulcers, and he developed one after 3 months of this, and he went to go see his brother-in-law, who the man who was married to his sister, who's Leonard Strong, the one who paid for his time at Towns. So he went to go get treated, and he complains to him, and Leonard realizes that he knows somebody who is a connection potentially to Rockefeller. Now, Bill had wanted to get connected to Rockefeller. Rockefeller was the richest man in the world. To this date, still was the richest man in the world. But you had to have connections. You had to know somebody back in those days. They didn't, they didn't call people up. They wrote letters. They did things to try to go through layers of people to get to the people with the money, because there was a lot of people who needed it. Now, Rockefeller was really charitable, really charitable. He had a whole, part of his business that was designed to driving charities. He built Riverside Church. There's a whole block in Manhattan that is devoted to non-denominational causes and nonprofits. And by the way, that very building is where GSO is today on Riverside Drive. So Leonard gives us a connection to a really good friend, and we're going to call him Uncle Dick. He's Uncle Dick because he was the uncle of one of Leonard's old girlfriends. So that's how far back he had to go in his memory. But Dick said, come right on over when he heard what it was about. He wanted to hear more. So what they did was they met together a couple of times. He really liked the idea, and he actually had lunch with Bill, and then he created this other meeting where at this meeting was Albert Scott. He was the chairman of the trustees of Riverside Bank. Our church, rather, Frank Amos, who was a close friend, and A. Leroy Chipman, manager of his personal affairs. Dr. Strong was there, Silky was there, Bill and Bob, and they told their stories, and Richardson was really interested, and they decided we're going to go forward and see if we can get a proposal. Now, this is Dr. Silkworth, Frank Amos, and A. Leroy Chipman, who were at that meeting. So here's the dialogues. They tell the stories, and Scott says, this is first century Christianity. What can we do for you? And then Bill gives them the pitch, what we're going to do with that money. And so Scott comes right back and says, won't money spoil this thing? Won't this creative professional class? We're hearing this over and over again. This is like being confirmed countless times. Won't it spoil the man-to-man approach that's been so effective? And won't this be a fatal diversion for your society? So, Bill explains, we're pretty poor. We need help. And so they decide, okay, we need to go ahead and put a proposal together for Rockefeller. So Frank Amos, who's at the meeting, he volunteers to go on his own dime to Akron to make an investigation. And he catches the contagion, we're told. This is a list. This is kind of how they did things in Akron. This is on, if you can see it, it's on Bob Smith's letterhead. It's a list of members. And so Frank Amos interviewed everybody in the group, interviewed people who worked with Dr. Bob in the community, just all kinds of people, and he caught the contagion, and he says, we really need to support this thing. And this is what we need to do. The group is unanimous. We need to hire a secretary for Dr. Bob because he didn't have one at the time, find him better office facilities that can include a place to do his 12-step work, get him a good, reliable car so he can have transportation, and provide him money for a couple of years to compensate him for the loss of his practice. So, but they did decide that ongoing support wouldn't be needed after a couple of years. Now, Frank Amos's detailed report can be found in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. There's several pages, so there's a lot to it. He really got what they were trying to do. But he went back to Rockefeller and he says, we should give these guys $50,000. That's going to cover all of this. He even looked at a place that could be used as a hospital to do this thing while he was there. So Uncle Dick, gets all on board too. He's really excited, and he goes to Rockefeller to give him the report. And after receiving, this is Rockefeller, this is Junior, who was the head of the Rockefeller Charities. And even though the project was something that he should have wanted to do, he also said, I'm afraid money's going to spoil this thing. And his reasons were exactly identical to the minority opinion expressed. Now, I say minority. Bill was driving the thing, so there was a lot of people, but they had concerns that weren't listened to. And so this is cautionary for us. This happens to us now. When I try to do things I shouldn't do, God kind of, shows me the way. So Uncle Dick says these guys are really bad. They're really dying if we don't support them. And so he says, okay, well, let's put $5,000 in the trust of the church for them to use. And basically what they did with that is they paid off Dr. Bob's house, and they had a little stipend that they could use, that they could draw from for a while. So, but he said to us, this fellowship should soon be self-supporting. Those were Rockefeller's words. So we're going to go from here. Let's see. The book is going to start to get written. And this is Honor Dealers, this picture. This is, Hank had a business and he offered the office space for our little fledgling society to do their work out of. And he also offered his secretary, Ruth Hawk, who was a very good friend of ours as well. That's her typewriter. That's the real typewriter, that she did all of this, and that she did all the work on that we're going to describe. So, and in the meantime, let's see, the foundation gets set up because they think, okay, so Rockefeller says, by the way, this $5,000, don't come back to me with any more requests. But you can go ahead and continue to do your fundraising with my blessing. So they decide they're going to set up a charitable trust so that it's tax deductible for their donators. Okay, so they made it broad. It's called Alcoholic Foundation because they thought it should be doing lots of stuff. Not just taking care of its members. And basically anything that had to do with an alcoholic except prohibition was in their mind at that time. So there was a young lawyer who set up the trust for on our behalf, and the legal definitions are a non-alcoholic is someone who can drink, and an alcoholic is someone who can't. So, and some of our friends served on that first board. So they continued to solicit, and they still didn't get anywhere. They even got Rockefeller's, he had a charitable, kind of party giver, who just could stir up money. And this guy, Carlson Sherwood, gave them all kinds of help. They had, by this time, Bill's story and There's a Solution had been written, and so they mimeographed copies of these. Whenever they were talking with anybody, they were giving it to the people. So Frank Amos decides, now this group of people get together on a regular basis to get ideas. What can we do next? And they have all kinds of them that I'm not telling you about. But the next one is that they know somebody. Frank Amos knows Eugene Exman at Harper and Row, and has him go look at the manuscript. And Exman says, I'm interested in this. Can you do a book in this style, an entire book, and how long will it take? But on the way home, and he wanted to offer him $1,500 in advance, which was a big deal. But on the way home, Bill is thinking, what if this is our text? What if this is our chief instrument and somebody else owns it? And what if this is successful? Thousands of people will need help, and we won't have the money to help them because we have to pay this advance back. But he went back and told the board the idea, and they liked it. And he was the minority this time. So now I'm going to talk about Hank. Now this is Bill describing Hank, so you have to keep this into context, okay? Bill was known as a power driver. So when Bill says that somebody is a hard-hitting salesman, who has big ideas and breathes confidence and has all this energy, calling him a power driver, that's saying something. And Hank was all of those things. He was a Standard Oil exec at one time, but he was an entrepreneurial type, and he had an idea a minute. His idea is this foundation thing isn't working after all these months. We still have nothing. So why don't we put this on a business basis and sell stocks to our own members, and that way we'll own the book. Now, we had the owning the book idea right, but the fundraising thing was a little bit different. But this idea, he just went with. He pushed. And Bill had to clean up behind him, because the members questioned why they were doing this. So even Exman at Harper said, that idea is right. You should own this book. And to his credit, he counteracted. So this is what happened, is Hank goes around the corner to the stationery store and he buys a book of stocks, blank stocks, and he types up on it, that this is $25 par value. He calls it Works Publishing because this is our first work of many. And he's done some research that, we can make a book for 35 cents and sell it for $3.50, and that's a markup of 100%. And, that's going to go out in carloads because Harper is interested in this. This is going to sell. But he writes on these at the bottom, Hank Pendergast, Parkhurst president. And he starts to go sell these to the members. None of them have money. And they don't believe it's going to happen. So he gets no traction there. So what they do next is they decide they're going to pitch Kenneth Payne at Reader's Digest and see if Reader's Digest will pick up a feature. And he says, this looks good. I'm going to have to check with my editorial staff and, get back to me. But Hank hears, I like it. And he goes and he tells people and he puts it on the prospectus that Reader's Digest is going to do a story. And the stocks start to sell a little bit. And what he does is he comes up with this scheme to break it in. A share is $25. You can pay it $5 a month for 5 months. And he runs around to the members, stirring up, getting the money. So they still had lots of expenses, and Charlie Towns, they had to see him for a loan of $2,500 to get them through because the subscribers were coming slowly. So I'm going to get to the writing of the book. Now, Bill never wrote in a vacuum. There's a misconception that he just did this. It was always a group conscience. Every word in the big book was the result of a group conscience and a huge struggle. As the chapters were completed, they were read out to the New York members, and then they were sent to Akron to be reviewed. Ironically, Akron loved everything that was written, and New York just had these heated debates. They just mauled them. So Ruth would have to retype, redistribute over and over again. By December of 1938, there were only 4 chapters done, and they still hadn't gotten to, how this program really works. So Bill this is the night that the 12 steps were written. He began to worry. This comes right out of the books that I'm going to give you references later on. He starts to get worried. He starts to get scared. He's fed up with these guys arguing all the time and the resistance that he's met and how much hassle it is. And he was really, really exhausted. And on top of that, he realizes he's never written a book before. And the subscribers are getting antsy. There's no progress. They want their money back. They bought stock in something that was supposed to sell. So he's in an anything but spiritual mood when he goes up to his room to write the 12 steps. and he was unable to focus, but it had to be done. So he starts, the first cut that he makes, there's 6, and it goes kind of along with what they were telling people. That's what the Oxford group tenets, these all relate to tenets of the Oxford group. It's pretty much what they were telling newcomers as they were coming in. That's what they were telling people in Akron. But it still wasn't definite enough. Bill decides that, it needs to be a little more clear and comprehensive, that maybe this book is going to get somewhere where we can't explain it, where we can't meet the people. And there cannot be a single loophole that a rationalizing alcoholic can slip through. So he relaxed and asked for guidance. He prayed in his way. And we come out with the original of the 12 steps. So I'm just going to blow through that. So the stories had to be written. This is in Dr. Bob's house. This is their dining room. Sue Smith actually typed out the stories in Akron. That's her typewriter. That's the real thing. There was, by this time in Akron, there was a person who had been sobered up. He'd been on Skid Row. He was a former feature writer of a newspaper. His name was Jim S. And he went with Dr. Bob, and they interviewed people and edited their stories, and Jim wrote them. And it was really hard. They didn't like doing that. Dr. Bob wrote his own, and Bill and Hank edited all those from New York. So there were 18 in the first edition of the Big Book from Akron, 2 from Cleveland, 10 from New York, and there was 1 from a non-alcoholic wife. So the stories were done at the end of January. So then comes the God debate, and most of the book was done by the end of January, but they still had this thing that they had to deal with. In New York, newbies were saying there's too many steps, there's too much God, and you're going to scare people away. The Akronites liked the steps again, and they were being mauled in New York. But New York had to go through a growing period. They had more people who were coming in who weren't in that process that I described that was repeated over and over again in Akron. They kind of had more unity in Akron. These people in New York were coming from different backgrounds, and they had to work out their differences. And so there were 3 camps. The conservative Christians, the liberals, who were actually the bare majority. They wanted it to be a spiritual, not a religious program. And then the radicals, the atheists and agnostics. Hank and Jim B. were the atheists, and they were a force to be reckoned with. And they wanted a psychological approach to be the focus. Bill was the umpire caught in the middle. And he was going to be the final judge, and they agreed to that. So I'm going to read this. To construct the most acceptable and effective book possible, every voice in it was playing its appointed part to create an outcome that was nothing less than providential. So the final compromise is the 10 strike. Are you asking a question? Okay.
Can you find James Burwell's story in the story in the Big Book?
Yes, I can, and it's actually going to be, I've got a list at the end that shows their stories.
Oh.
Yes, that's okay. I think it's the vicious cycle. So, okay. And he went through a vicious cycle, that's a fact. And his story is actually also in the 12 traditions. He was the one who they hoped got drunk because he was talking all the time that I don't like this God stuff. And he ended up getting drunk and coming back, and they worked it out. But this is the thing, that discord, that working toward group conscience really helped New York to become more secure in their program and what they were doing. And even though the Midwesterners and the East Coasters had differences, they had enough that was similar that they could get along. So the final concessions, they really, and Hank was the one who really drove this one in. There were certain things that he was convinced had to change or this wasn't going to go. And so after lots of talking, he made those concessions. And in step 2, it's a power greater than ourselves, and God as we understand him in 3 and 11. And in step 7, on our knees was taken out. It used to say that we do that on our knees. So, and here are the steps we took, which are suggested. So these changes widened the gateway to those who had, either had faith or little faith or no faith. So after that, they wanted to get feedback from our partners in medicine and religion. They wanted to make sure that it would be widely received by other people who were involved with alcoholics. So they sent out 400 mimeographed, they call them multi-lith copies, to noted, physicians and, ministers, and they got back really favorable feedback. In fact, they got back, I don't believe they got anything back. There was a suggestion, they made really constructive suggestions, and one of the suggestions resulted in the doctor's opinion being added. And as it turns out, the verdict of all denominations, practically all denominations, is that we had this right. So the final updates in printer's copy, it's a mock-up of what that looked like, the multi-lith copies and the printer's copy. Hank had the best handwriting. They had to make all the changes on one copy to take to the printer. And there's an example up here, and you can see, and you can look at the break, how many changes there were. There's just one page, there's tons of them. This book was published by Hazelden in, I think, 2008. They got permission from the person who bought the manuscript the first time, and we gave them permission to mass produce this book. And so we have access to that original manuscript in this form, if you're interested in seeing it. But Hank carefully crossed out all the I's and made it we, and, all the strong language that needed to be taken out. You shall, or you must, became ought or should, and it became a we program in addition to some other things, and those final changes that I had just described. So then they went through these pains for publication, so they got this all done. They take it to the printer. They take it to Cornwall Press, to the guy at Edward Blackwell, and they got the quotes from that it's going to cost 35 cents a copy to do, and he says, they want 5,000 copies, and he says, what kind of a down payment can you make? And Hank makes it up out of the air. They have no money. He says, $500 will make a down payment. So he pretty much conned that guy into going forward. And, we have him to thank for that for a lot of reasons. But Hank and poor Ruth and Dorothy Snyder from Cleveland take this, and it was literally this size, this tattered, beat-up copy. They take it to the printer, to the print manager. So see, they did the deal in the main office, and then they go to the print plant, and the print manager says, whoa, this is terrible. I can't do this. And it almost sent them home. Well, Hank convinced that guy to make galleys, and so they churned it. They stayed in a hotel room nearby, and the three of them, they daily made corrections and corrections and corrections until the print plates were ready. Now, they didn't have the money to pay the bill for the hotel, so Bill has to go back and ask Charlie Towns for money again. So then they go back to Reader's Digest. They say, we're ready to go. We're ready to shoot. And the guy says, I forgot to tell you, I talked to the editors and they want nothing to do with this. You were supposed to check with me. And so we had selective hearing there. So they were pretty shocked. But the printing began in April 1939, and it had to be kind of taken out of hock. They had to go, I believe it was Fitz's sister, gave them a loan for $1,000, and they got some other loans to get the book out of hock so they could actually sell it to people if they wanted it. So there are some other things that happened in the summer of 1939 that are really, really important. Everybody was going into debt just for living expenses. Nothing was moving. I mean, this has been a couple of years. Bill and Lois lose the Clinton Street house at this point. And all their worldly goods go into a warehouse because they don't have the money to pay even the mover. So from this point, I have a book here called Lois Remembers, and she has a different view. She kept records. She had a diary, and she was sober. So she knew what was going on. So I kind of go with her rendition with certain things. And so what she says, though, is they started a period of 2 years with what she calls living around. And she counted in her diaries 51 times in those 2 years that they moved from place to place, and that wasn't counting weekend outings. With no home. They were homeless. So the Lois W. Home Replacement Fund was started by alcoholics and their families. It was held in trust in the foundation, and they had a little bit coming in to help with their living expenses. Also, they get evicted from Hank's place, Honor Dealers, and they move nearby to a tiny office that you couldn't even there was like a desk, and you had to stand, and that was it. So there was room for Ruth and her typewriter, and one chair, and that was it. So Hank starts to look for work elsewhere, and Ruth starts receiving a theoretical salary. They start ripping her off those stock certificates every week, and she takes that as pay. She has to go live at home. And by the way, what I forgot to tell you is that the first woman who was sober in New York, Florence, actually looked after Ruth's son so that she could do this work for us. And Florence was the one woman who objected to the title 100 Men. And I've got down here that Ty M's wife takes her trip, and that's how she takes a big book. His ex-wife is a non-alcoholic who goes on a Panama cruise, and somehow that big book gets to Los Angeles, and that's how we get here. So they need publicity because the book's been published, nobody's buying. They've been trying to get national magazines to carry story with no success, and Reader's Digest was a total miscue. So they get this idea, and it's Hank's idea that, they've got a drunk, Morgan R., who's a good friend with Gabriel Heater, who has a radio show called We the People and runs 3-minute spots. And, they're friends, and so he can get on there. Well, Morgan is just newly sober, and so they have to babysit him for like a week to make sure that he's sober at the time that this interview is happening. And so they put him up in a club room that somebody else paid for, and they babysat him round the clock so he would be on his game. And he did well. But what happened was they decided to send 500 postcards to every doctor east of the Mississippi. And they needed money for that. And it cost, ironically, $500 that somebody else had to put up again. And they sent out that, so they listen for the radio broadcast, and it's really successful. He does a great job. And they wait a couple of days, and they're just sure that those postcards are going to be there. And they actually carry suitcases up the steps to the box to get it. And they look in, and they can't see anything. And Hank's still he's just sure that there's tons of it. They got to have it in the back. They end up having only 12 returned postcards out of that, so it costs a lot of money for that. And there were only 2 book orders in there, and a lot of criticism. So from the time the big book is published until the first real publicity happens was several months. And the first thing that we know is that Faith Magazine interviewed Dr. Bob, and it's not talked about very much. And what happened as a result of that is that we got 12 more physicians who were on our side, and they were all over the East Coast. And actually, that might have been one of the first anonymity breaks, because I believe that someone remembers that Dr. Bob signed his name to that. But in September, Liberty Magazine writes an article called Alcoholics and God. And the articles that I'm going to be describing to you are in this book, in this white binder right here, if you have interest in reading them. Alcoholics and God is the first one in Liberty Magazine, and they have no money to handle any kind of replies or requests for help. So Bert T. in New York, he owns a Fifth Avenue clothes shop. He literally puts his shop on the hawk to do a promissory deal for $1,000 to cover this. And then after that, the Cleveland Plain Dealer series happens. In Cleveland, 7 articles are written It's a daily newspaper, and so it wasn't in a row, but it was over a couple of weeks, and those articles are in this book over here too. And we start to get some traction, and we start to get some responses. We had about 800 responses to the Liberty magazine alone, and Cleveland was even more. So we start to see a correspondence growing. Bill and Ruth are actually answering these pleas for help. They're sending books out, and a correspondence is starting. And at the same time, groups that are forming are writing in and asking for help because they're getting into trouble. And so this is the start of headquarters. So next comes the Rockefeller dinner. And it was in February of 1940. Now, Rockefeller had been watching us. He said, don't come back, but he had been watching us. And the party planner had talked him into that this is a good thing to do. So they invite 400 people, and 75 show up. And because they're not sure how the alcoholics are going to behave, they say no press is allowed. And so we have speakers from from the medical field and from religion, and we have sober alcoholics seated at every table answering questions. And one of them is Morgan R., who just 2 weeks before had come out of the loony bin, literally. And the men sitting with him say, what do you do? Where do you work? And he says, this is where I'm from. And they go, wow, this is real. So at the end of it, so Rockefeller Jr. is sick that night, so his son Nelson is the one who's doing this. And at the end of the dinner, he suddenly says, gentlemen, you can see that this is a work of goodwill, without any thought of financial income or reward. Therefore, it is our belief that Alcoholics Anonymous should be self-supporting as far as money is concerned. All it needs is your goodwill. At that moment, $1 billion of support walked out the door, and Bill and Bob and everyone were crushed. But basically what happened was Rockefeller Jr. wrote a personal letter to every one of those 400 guests. They had made transcripts of the talks that they included, and he bought a book that was sent with every one of those. And he said, these guys need money basically, and I'm going to give them a one-time gift of $1,000. And what that did was it gave permission for people to give this temporary support. So they got a total of $3,000 out of that deal. But what they really got was the press release that went around the world. They wrote a press release. His public people put it together, and the press was really, really curious, and it went on the newswire all around the world, and the police started coming in for help, and books started to sell. And it is at the end of that year, Akron decides that they're going to leave the Oxford group, and that was a really tough decision for them. They were really, really loyal to the Williams, who had done so much for them, but Henrietta Seiberling did not like the big book. And so there was a fight, kind of a three-way fight that went between her and Clarice and Ann Smith, and the women settled it, and the men just followed along. So they were out of there. So headquarters in the foundation moved to Vesey Street. I don't have a picture of that. It was demolished. This is the beginning of the end, though, between our friendship with Hank. He was pretty hurt. He wanted it kept in Newark, but Bill was insistent that it be centralized, that it would serve more people. And books started to sell, and subscribers started to get antsy. We know you're making money. Why aren't you paying us back? So Ruth gets to draw a salary, a little bit of a salary, and she gets an assistant, Lorraine Green. So next comes something that's really important. Works is kind of a mess. It was never properly incorporated. It had never had a financial report written auditing back to the beginning of everything that they did. So Bill and Ruth got their first stockholders report together, and it showed a $3,000 book profit. So the shareholders wanted that money. They wanted to see some of that money. And what they had to do is, instead of selling 25 par stock, Bill makes preferred stock of $150 and sets out with some newer members to try to get some money. And by then they're sick of the stock stuff, so they want a promissory note personally endorsed by Bill and Bob, and then they'll give him the $3,000 that he needs to to pay back Charlie Towns, who's also antsy, and to pay the few grumbling stockholders that just aren't handling it. And an accountant kind of audits the books and gets them straight from the beginning, and then hands it off to one of us who's also an accountant, and they did that for free. So they found out that they owed about $8,000 in order to repay the subscribers. They wanted to buy back the stocks because 49 people had pieces of works, and they wanted to try to get that back, and they wanted to pay back everybody who had lent them money. So Bill turns his shares in. Now he had 1/3, Hank had 1/3, and 1/3 were sold to other people. But by this time, Hank is drinking again, and he's really hard to deal with. And he's really upset. There were some other things that happened. He divorced his wife. He wanted to marry Ruth, and she wasn't having it. And so he ends up drinking, and he was a mean drunk, a very mean drunk. And so his were hard to get back, but he was pretty hard up. And they had this kind of leverage because his furniture was still in the office. So they paid him $200 for the furniture in his stocks. And Bill says that they kind of did him a disservice to do that. He owns that, but Hank did not die sober. He didn't make it. He was a good friend to us. For 4 years, he was sober at a really crucial time in our development, and he was an important voice. So at this time, our society, through the trustees, owns the book entirely. So next comes the Jack Alexander article in the Saturday Evening Post. Now, Jack Alexander was an investigative reporter. He had just got finished blowing the doors off the mob stuff, the rackets, and he was sure we were one of those. And so he embedded with us, and he went to Akron, and he went to New York, and they gave him a deep dive into everything we do, and he caught the contagion and became one of our good friends also. He wrote this article, and they knew it was going to have a big response because this was a national magazine that was highly read. Lois, by the way, planned and organized the entire effort to handle the response that was coming. And it was a different time, ladies, so what the writing says is they needed every AA woman and AA wife that could use a typewriter to do this work. And they set out a temporary office at the top floor of the 24th Street Clubhouse for temporary office space to handle this. And Bobby B. comes into the picture. Now, you may have heard her name. She became the second secretary of ours, and she was one who corresponded a lot with people in groups. And so you'll hear she was not proud. She was really, really humble. And so we have no images of her, and we have very little about her. There's only a couple of places where she's mentioned, but she was an important part of us. So but for days and days, Ruth and the volunteers tried to answer the tide of mail that was coming in from individuals and from distant groups who were, by this time, going through some really serious growing pains. And I will tell you, one of those is that while Hank was out running, he went and stirred up some trouble in Cleveland and Akron, and kind of let them know that those guys over there are making money on this deal. And so Bill and Bob end up having to go account later on as a result of his stuff. So, and here we are at the end here. So books are selling, and self-support becomes a reality for us. We need paid permanent help to run that office, to respond to those people. And for the first time, we ask AA groups to contribute. It's going to be for office expenses only, and it's going to be entirely voluntary, and their suggestion was $1 per member per year. So the group contributions and the net income guaranteed the solvency of our operations. So this is just a chart that shows our growth. From June 1935 to December 1941, that's not a very long period of time. And these children of chaos, this band of drunks, made this happen, and this with our higher powers' help. So here is, we owe a debt of gratitude to these people, neither the book or our fellowship, because our fellowship takes the name Alcoholics Anonymous after the book. And I didn't talk about all the names because I think you've heard that before, and I wanted to get through the other things. But you see in red, these are our non-alcoholic friends, and this is just one of 3 pages. So on this particular slide, it shows the stories that were written by the alcoholics, and in green, these people started these groups that are here. So I'll leave that there for a minute so you can take a look. It is not, but you're welcome to come and look at my computer. And this is the second page. When those multi-lists went out, Dr. Harry Thibault became one of our friends, and he was Marty Mann's psychiatrist, and he gave her a multi-list copy, and she got sober from it, not from the book. It took her a while, and she fought it, but she was a test case for whether or not this would work for an alcoholic. And there's the third page. See how much red? These are folks who are not alcoholic, who we owe a debt of gratitude to. And then there are the unnamed people, many AAs and not AAs. The 400 at the Rockefeller dinner, we don't have their names. So a final thought, the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and our texts are the map that points the way to the treasure. The real treasure is the spiritual awakening and personal relationship with a higher power. Thank you, God of our understanding, for that treasure.